Welcome back, night crawlers. If you're here, you already know the shadows in holy places run deeper than anywhere else. And tonight, we're stepping into the one city on earth where God and the devil share the same postal code. This is the Veil of Sanctity, a based on true events series about a forbidden restoration project deep beneath St. Peter's Basilica, where ancient machinery built to bind and hide papal relics has begun to wake up and feed. What started as a routine contract job for a small team of lay restorers turns into the Vatican's most tightly guarded horror in centuries. One simple safety rule ignored, one loose garment, one blocked emergency path, and the holiest workplace on earth becomes a tomb. Chapter 1. The Summons. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late October, slipped beneath the plain wooden door of the restoration studio in Trastevere like a communion wafer under a tongue. Thick cream paper. Vatican watermark barely visible when held to the light. Sealed with scarlet wax that carried the faint scent of myrrh and old blood. No return address. Only 3 words in perfect calligraphic Latin on the outside. Maria Lucia Varghese, personaliter. Inside, a single paragraph in Italian, so formal it felt colder than the marble floors of St. Peter's. She was requested, not invited, to present herself at the Archivio Apostolico Vaticano the following dawn. Dressed in civilian clothing, no religious habit, no rosary visible, no questions asked of anyone. A car would wait at the corner of Via della Lungara at 4:45 a.m. sharp. Maria Lucia read it 3 times, her fingers brushing the embroidered edge of the pale blue dupatta draped loosely over her shoulders, a habit she could never quite break, even after 10 years working in Rome. The silk had been her mother's, brought from Kerala, the color of early morning monsoons. She folded the letter along its original creases, slid it into the pocket of her work apron, and went back to teasing a 12th century psalter away from the acid-eaten vellum that had fused to its cover. But her hands shook, only slightly, enough that the scalpel nicked the gold leaf and left a hairline scar across the halo of an angel who would now, forever, look wounded. At 4:42 a.m., the next morning she stood on the empty street, breath fogging in the Roman chill, dupatta wrapped twice around her neck against the wind that smelled of river rot and incense. A black Mercedes with tinted windows and no plates purred to the curb. The driver never spoke, never looked in the rearview mirror. They passed through the Porta Sant'Anna before the Swiss guards had even changed shift, descended a ramp she did not know existed, and emerged into a loading bay lit by a single sodium lamp the color of dying embers. An elderly priest in a plain black cassock waited beside a freight elevator that looked older than electricity itself. His face was a map of deep creases, eyes the pale gray of winter skies over the Tiber. Monsignor Gregorio Rinaldi, she would later learn, for now he simply inclined his head, pressed a brass button worn smooth by centuries of fingers, and the gates rattled open like bones in a crypt. The elevator dropped so slowly she felt it in her stomach long before her feet registered the motion, down past the public levels of the archives, past the climate-controlled rooms where tourists were allowed to glimpse Michelangelo's letters under glass, down further, until the air grew thick with the smell of wet stone, candle smoke long extinct, and something metallic, like the inside of a mouth after you've bitten your tongue. The gates opened onto a corridor lit by bare bulbs strung along a wire. The floor slanted gently downward, water seeping between the bricks in slow, deliberate tears. At the far end, a wooden door bound with iron straps. Monsignor Rinaldi produced a key the length of a man's forearm and turned it with both hands. The lock sighed as if it had been holding its breath since the French Revolution. They stepped into the bindery. It was larger than she expected, almost cavernous, carved out of the living tufa rock beneath the necropolis. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into shadow. Along the walls, shelves rose 3 stories high, reached by rolling ladders of blackened oak. Thousands of volumes waited there, some chained, some wrapped in silk, some simply staring out with cracked leather spines, like empty eye sockets. In the center of the room stood the press, 18 feet tall, forged of brass gone green with age, its plates the size of altar stones, chains as thick as a man's wrist hung from pulleys overhead, vanishing into slots cut into the ceiling. Counterweights, massive blocks of carved marble, were hidden somewhere above. Balanced on a system no one had fully mapped since 1789, the year the machine had supposedly been built to destroy heretical books confiscated from France, rather than let them fall into revolutionary hands. Historians still argued in hushed footnotes whether those weights sat directly above the excavated tomb of St. Peter himself. The church had never allowed ground penetrating radar to find out. 4 other lay workers were already there, standing in a loose semicircle as if gathered for a group photograph no one wanted to smile for. Luca, the master bookbinder from Bologna, tall and thin with ink-stained fingers that never stopped moving. Sophia, the parchment specialist, barely 25, Roman-born, eyes too old for her face. Anna, Maria Lucia's closest friend in the city, another textile conservator, Neapolitan, always laughing too loudly to cover nerves. And Matteo, the quiet engineer from Turin who maintained the ancient mechanisms, his tool belt clinking softly whenever he breathed. They greeted her with the subdued nods of people who had already been warned not to ask questions. Monsignor Rinaldi closed the door behind her. The lock clicked like a jaw snapping shut. Benvenuti, he said, voice soft, almost tender. You are now in the scriptorium inferiore. From this moment, what you see, what you hear, what you touch, it belongs to the church and to God alone. You will speak of it to no one, not your confessor, not your mother, not the pillow you lay your head upon at night. Capite? 5 heads nodded. He gestured toward the press. The work is simple in appearance. We are rebinding a small collection of volumes that should have remained closed. The machine has not been used in 93 years. It is temperamental. It remembers. Anna gave a nervous laugh that died quickly against the stone walls. Rinaldi ignored it. You will work in shifts of 2, never alone. You will wear no loose clothing that can catch. You will keep the aisles clear at all times. You will pray often. He turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. The press sometimes sings. When it does, do not answer. The door closed. The lock turned. The bare bulbs flickered once, as if bowing. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Luca walked forward, and laid his palm against the cold brass. The metal was warm, far above them, somewhere in the dark maze of chains and counterweights. Something shifted with a sound like a very slow heartbeat. And then, so faintly that Maria Lucia thought at first it was the blood in her own ears. The machine began to hum, a low, resonant C sharp that climbed inside the bones and settled behind the eyes. It was not electrical. It was not steam. It was the sound a cathedral makes when it dreams of screaming. Anna whispered, Madonna Santa. Maria Lucia's fingers found the edge of her dupatta, twisting the silk tight around her wrist as if it were a lifeline. She stared up into the blackness where the chains disappeared, and for just a second she thought she saw something move, something pale and elongated, sliding between the links like a tongue tasting air. The hum grew sweeter, almost welcoming. She took one involuntary step forward. The bulbs flickered again, and the press fell silent. But the warmth remained, and somewhere deep in the stone, a single drop of water fell, then another and another, keeping time. Maria Lucia forced herself to turn away, to focus on the practical. The others were already unpacking crates, tools wrapped in oilcloth, bottles of handmade glue that smelled of rabbit skin and cloves, reels of linen thread dyed with indigo and madder root. Normal smells, safe smells, the kind that belonged in sunlit studios with windows open to the Roman sky. Not here where the air tasted of crypt dust and candle stubs burned 1,000 years ago. Luca lifted out a volume bound in dark leather, its title page long since rotted away. Even from across the room, she could see the faint raised bands on the spine, the ghost of gold tooling that might once have been a papal coat of arms. He set it on the laying press as gently as if it were a sleeping child. We begin with this one, he said, voice steady but too loud in the hush. Tomorrow we test the big press. Tonight we prepare. Night. All ready? There were no clocks, no windows, only the slow drip of water and the soft clink of Matteo checking the tension on a secondary chain that ran along the floor like a sleeping serpent. Anna sidled up to Maria Lucia, bumping shoulders. You okay, Cara? You look like you've seen the devil's laundry list. I'm fine. She lied. The dupatta felt heavier now, the embroidered border scratching against her collarbone. She started to pull it off, then stopped. Taking it off felt like stripping naked in front of strangers. Sophia was lighting candles, real wax tapers, not electric lamps, because the bulbs were too harsh for examining pigments. The flames painted the walls the color of old bruises. Shadows leapt across the shelves, making the chained books twitch like prisoners testing their restraints. One candle refused to stay lit. She struck match after match, the sulfur sharp and acrid, until finally the wick caught. But the flame burned blue for 3 heartbeats before settling into normal gold. No one mentioned it. Hours slipped by in a rhythm older than any of them, cutting, sewing, gluing, pressing by hand. The small laying presses were gentle things compared to the monster in the center of the room. They worked in silence broken only by the snip of scissors and the soft rasp of bone folders against paper. At some point, Matteo disappeared up one of the ladders to oil a pulley near the ceiling. They heard the squeak of his shoes on the rungs, the faint clatter of his toolkit, then nothing for a long time. When he came down, his face was the color of ash. Everything all right? Luca asked. Matteo nodded too quickly. Just tight spaces up there. The chains go deeper than I thought. He didn't say how deep. No one asked. Maria Lucia's job was to reinforce the end bands of the dark volume with silk thread the color of dried blood. As she worked, her needle passed through holes that had been made centuries ago by hands now dust. She felt the book breathing under her fingers, slow, patient inhalations that lifted the cover a millimeter each time she blinked. She told herself it was the glue drying, nothing more. Anna leaned over. "Look at this," she whispered, tilting the open book so only Maria Lucia could see. On the flyleaf, barely visible beneath a water stain, someone had drawn a tiny face in iron gall ink, a woman screaming. Her mouth was a perfect O, and around her neck was a line that could have been a scarf or a noose. Maria Lucia's needle slipped. A single drop of blood welled on her thumb, bright against the pale silk thread, before she could wipe it away. The drop fell, landing exactly on the inked mouth of the screaming woman. The ink drank it, spread. The tiny face now had red lips. Anna saw it too. Her breath caught. From the center of the room came the hum again, louder this time, rising and falling like a lullaby sung by something with too many teeth. Luca slammed the book shut. "Enough for tonight," he said, voice cracking on the last word. "We'll start fresh when the Monsignor returns." They packed tools with shaking hands. The candles guttered one by one, as if an unseen mouth were blowing them out when the last flame died. The bare bulbs seemed harsher, crueler, throwing their shadows against the press in ways that made arms too long, necks too thin. Maria Lucia reached for her dupatta to wrap it tighter and felt resistance. Just a tug, gentle, almost curious. The embroidered end had caught on something behind her. She turned, nothing there, but the silk was stretched taut, leading into the narrow gap between two crates of marble fragments stacked carelessly near the press, crates that blocked the direct path to the only door. She pulled. The dupatta came free with a soft ripping sound. A single thread remained behind, quivering, as though something on the other side had decided to keep a souvenir, high above, in the dark. The counterweights shifted again. This time the sound was not a heartbeat. It was a swallow. Chapter 2: The Weight of Centuries. The second morning began with the taste of iron in the mouth, the way it does when you've clenched your jaw all night and dreamed of falling. Monsignor Rinaldi arrived at what they guessed was 6 a.m. No bells reached this depth, carrying a small tin box that rattled like loose teeth. Inside were 7 brass tokens, each stamped with a different lamb. He placed one in every palm without ceremony. "These open the gate to the counterweight shafts," he said. "1 token per person per day. Lose it, and you do not leave until someone notices you're missing. Sometimes that takes a week." He didn't smile when he said it. Matteo, the engineer, took his token between thumb and forefinger as though it might burn him. We're going up there? Down, Rinaldi corrected, and up and sideways. The press was never meant to be understood, only fed. He led them to a section of wall that looked no different from any other, rough tufa blocks sweating moisture, until he pressed his token into a shallow recess shaped like a screaming mouth. Stone ground on stone, a panel 3 feet wide slid inward, exhaling a breath that smelled of tomb dust and melted candle wax. Beyond was a spiral staircase, bored straight into the bedrock, so narrow their shoulders scraped both walls. The steps were worn into scoops by centuries of feet that had descended but not always returned. No railing, just the slow drip of water and the faint metallic echo of chains moving somewhere far ahead, like something enormous turning in its sleep. They went single file, Rinaldi first, then Luca, Sophia, Anna, Maria Lucia, Matteo last, each of them holding a beeswax candle that refused to burn bright. The flames shrank to blue teardrops the deeper they went, as if the air itself were starving them. After what felt like 200 steps, but could have been 50 or 500, the staircase opened into a cavernous vertical shaft. Iron walkways crisscrossed the darkness, like the ribs of a fossilized whale, suspended in the center, wrapped in chains thicker than a man's thigh. Were the counterweights, 6 enormous blocks of white Carrara marble, each carved with reliefs of angels whose wings had been deliberately defaced, eyes gouged, mouths stopped with lead. The blocks hung motionless now, but faint scratches on the stone showed where they had once swung, directly beneath them, barely visible in the gloom. A circle of ancient brickwork, the sealed roof of St. Peter's original tomb. Historians had argued for decades whether the press's foundation actually rested on the apostles' bones or merely hovered inches above. The church's official position was that the question itself was profane. Matteo let out a low whistle that died instantly against the damp. "It's gravity-powered," he whispered. "The weights drop in sequence. Turn the main screw. Apply 40 tons of pressure in under 8 seconds. No steam, no electricity, just gravity and prayer. And sin," Rinaldi added quietly. The machine was commissioned in 1789 to destroy books the Revolution had tainted. They say the weights were consecrated with water from the Jordan. Others say the water came from somewhere else entirely. Anna crossed herself so hard her knuckles cracked. Maria Lucia felt the air change around her dupatta, heavier, clinging, as though the fabric had absorbed the shaft's chill and was now trying to drag her downward. She tucked the embroidered end into her belt, but the silk resisted, sliding out again like a mischievous child. They spent the morning mapping the chains. Matteo and Luca climbed the walkways with measuring tapes and oil cans, voices echoing strangely. Sophia traced the defaced angels with gloved fingers, muttering Latin under her breath. Anna stayed close to Maria Lucia, humming Neapolitan lullabies that sounded wrong in this place, too cheerful, like whistling in a cemetery. At one point, Matteo called them all to a narrow platform directly above the largest weight. From here they could see the main drive chain descending through a hole no wider than a coffin lid, vanishing into absolute black. "Listen," he said, and struck the chain with his wrench. The note that came back was not metal on metal. It was deeper, something between a church organ and a dying whale. The sound traveled down the chain and into the depths, and for a moment, every candle flame bowed in the same direction, as if genuflecting. Then, from far below, an answer, a soft, wet tearing, like silk being ripped very slowly by patient hands. Anna grabbed Maria Lucia's arm. Tell me you heard that. Maria Lucia had. Her stomach flipped. She looked down at her dupatta. The border had worked loose again. One corner fluttered over the edge of the platform, caught in a draft that came from nowhere. She reached to pull it back. The fabric snagged. Not on the railing. There was no railing, but on something ornamental jutting from the marble weight itself. A small brass fleur-de-lis, green with verdigris, shaped like a claw. The embroidered edge of her dupatta caught perfectly in its curl. For one heartbeat, the silk went taut. The counterweight shifted, just a fraction, barely enough to hear the chains complain. Everyone froze. Then the fleur-de-lis rotated a quarter turn, as if turned by an invisible hand, and released the cloth. The dupatta fluttered free. Luca laughed first, too loud, too sharp. Careful, sister, the machine's got taste, only goes for the pretty ones. Sophia giggled nervously. Even Matteo managed a smirk. Anna punched Maria Lucia lightly on the shoulder. Next time, wear a burqa, eh? Maria Lucia forced a smile, but her fingers trembled as she knotted the dupatta tight around her waist. The silk was warm where it had touched the brass, too warm, like skin after a blush. Rinaldi said nothing, only watched the weight with those winter gray eyes, as though waiting to see if it would move again. It didn't. They finished the survey in silence by the time they climbed back to the bindery. The candles were guttering skeletons of wax, and every footstep left a print of sweat on the stone. The rest of the day passed in a haze of ordinary horror, sewing end bands, mixing wheat paste that smelled faintly of rot, burnishing gold leaf that flaked away like dead skin. The press stood in the center of the room, patient as a spider. At some point, the Monsignor left them with a final instruction. Tonight, 2 of you will stay to guard the first volume while the glue dries. The rest may sleep upstairs in the guest quarters. Choose wisely. They drew lots with scraps of vellum. Maria Lucia and Anna lost, or won, depending on how you measured. The others filed out, footsteps fading up the corridor until the iron door boomed shut and the lock turned like a verdict. Anna tried to make light of it. She brewed coffee on a camping stove, sang dirty songs from Naples, told stories about her nonna who once slapped a priest for looking at her legs. But her voice cracked on the high notes, and every time the glue pot bubbled, it sounded like something boiling in pain. By midnight, the candles were low and the shadows thick as velvet. Anna finally curled up on a pile of felt blankets and fell asleep with her rosary twisted around her wrist like handcuffs. Maria Lucia could not. She sat on a stool beside the laying press, watching the dark volume breathe under its weighted board. The air had grown colder. Her breath came in small white ghosts. She pulled the dupatta up over her shoulders for warmth. That was when she heard it again, tearing, slow, deliberate, patient, coming from directly beneath the floor, directly beneath the spot where the main screw of the great press disappeared into stone. Rip, pause, rip. Like someone far below was taking a piece of silk, the exact length and weight of her dupatta, and pulling it, inch by inch, through a crack too small for anything else. She stood, heart hammering against her ribs. The sound stopped the moment her bare feet touched the floor. Silence. Then, softer than a whisper, the faint rustle of fabric brushing stone, moving away deeper. Anna stirred in her sleep, murmured something about fish and blood. Maria Lucia took one candle, its flame now the color of old bone, and walked to the exact center of the room, directly under the brass screw that rose like a pillar into darkness. She knelt, pressed her ear to the floor, and heard, very clearly, the sound of breathing on the other side of the stone, slow, wet, reverent, inhaling the scent of monsoon blue silk and Kerala spices that had no business being this far underground. Something down there exhaled her name, not with a voice, with the sound of fabric tearing one final time. The candle went out. In the perfect dark, Maria Lucia felt the dupatta lift from her shoulders of its own accord, the embroidered end trailing across her cheek like a lover's finger saying goodbye. When she grabbed it, the silk was already cold and heavier, as though it had been dragging something up from the depths, something that had decided not to let go. Far below, the counterweights began to sing, a low, hungry note that climbed inside the bones and promised. Soon. Chapter 3. The First Binding. The book waited on the laying table like a patient that had already died but refused to lie still. It was smaller than Maria Lucia expected for something that carried so much dread, no larger than a missile, bound in leather the color of dried liver, its boards warped from centuries of damp. When Luca lifted it from the felt-lined crate, the spine cracked with a sound like knuckles popping in prayer. A faint odor rose, frankincense gone rancid, mixed with something sweeter, almost cloying, like roses left too long in a sick room. Monsignor Rinaldi stood at the head of the table, gloved hands folded as though in benediction. "This is the Liber Velocis Umbrae," he said, voice barely above the drip of water somewhere behind the walls. 14th century northern Italian provenance, though some paleographers insist the vellum was cured south of Naples, in skin taken from volunteers. He let the word hang, tasting it. It was scheduled for destruction in 1789. The press was built for it, and others like it. But the order was countermanded at the last moment. Politics, always politics. Anna made a small sound in her throat, half laugh, half prayer. She had tied her hair back with a red ribbon that morning, bright as arterial blood against her dark curls. "So we're giving the devil a new suit," she muttered in Neapolitan, low enough that only Maria Lucia heard. "Hope he likes the cut." The work began gently, almost tenderly. Sophia paired new vellum with a spoke shave that whispered across the surface like a secret. Luca sewed the sections on cords of hand-twisted hemp, his long fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon. Matteo oiled the great screw of the press until the brass gleamed like molten gold under the bare bulbs. Maria Lucia and Anna prepared the covering leather, goat, dyed the deep crimson of a cardinal's mozzetta, soft as a confession. They spoke little. The air had thickened overnight, pressing against the eardrums the way altitude does on a mountain road. Every breath tasted of iron and candle smoke. The dupatta around Maria Lucia's shoulders felt heavier than usual, as though it had absorbed moisture from the walls and now carried the weight of centuries. By late afternoon, or what passed for it down here, the book was ready for its final pressing. The new cover had been adhered, the end bands sewn in silk the color of dried bone. All that remained was to place it between the great plates and let the counterweights do their slow, inevitable work. Rinaldi himself carried the volume to the press. The chains overhead stirred at his approach, links shifting with a sound like rosary beads poured from a dead man's hand. He laid the book on the lower platen, an oak board the size of a coffin lid, and stepped back. "Two of you only," he said. "The rest observe from the marked line." He indicated a faded stripe of red paint on the floor, 10 feet back. When the screw descends, do not cross it. The weights remember their purpose. Luca and Matteo took the wheel, an iron circle large enough for 4 men, though only 2 were needed. Anna and Maria Lucia stood behind the line with Sophia, close enough to feel the heat rising from the brass as the mechanism woke. Luca began to turn. The wheel resisted at first, groaning like an old man rising from prayer. Then it caught, and the great screw began its descent. Inch by inch, the upper platen lowered, chains paying out above with a sound that was almost melodic, a slow, descending scale in a minor key. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, their breath plumed white. Anna shifted her weight, restless. "It's beautiful," she whispered, eyes fixed on the descending plate, like watching a cathedral close its doors forever. Maria Lucia felt it then, a tug, gentle but insistent, at the small of Anna's back. She saw her friend's red ribbon lift, as though caught in a draft that touched nothing else. Anna reached back absently to tuck it in. The ribbon slipped free and fluttered upward, drawn toward the ceiling as if by an unseen mouth. Anna laughed nervously. "Che cazzo." That was when her dupatta, no, not a dupatta. Anna wore a light linen scarf, the kind Roman women tie loosely in summer, began to move, not flutter, move. The fringed end rose, straightening, pointing toward the narrow gap where the main chain disappeared into the stone. Maria Lucia saw it happen in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The scarf lifted, wrapped itself once around Anna's throat, like a caressing hand, then snapped taut. Anna's eyes widened. Her hands flew to her neck, fingers scrabbling at fabric that suddenly felt like wire. The chain above jerked, once sharply, and Anna was yanked off her feet. She rose slowly at first, toes dragging across the stone, scarf cutting deep into the soft skin under her jaw. A thin line of blood appeared, bright against the white linen. Her mouth opened in a scream that came out wet and strangled. Anna! Maria Lucia lunged forward, but Sophia's arms locked around her waist, dragging her back behind the red line. Matteo and Luca spun the wheel in reverse, faces purple with effort. The screw groaned but did not rise. Something above had taken the weight, something that wanted it. Anna ascended toward the ceiling, body arching like a bowstring. The scarf had twisted into a perfect noose now, the fringe brushing the gears that waited in the dark. From the shadows came the soft, intimate sound of cloth on metal, caressing, tasting. Rinaldi shouted something in Latin, voice cracking for the first time. He ran for the emergency stop, a simple iron lever set into the wall, meant to drop a pin into the main gear. The path was blocked. Crates of marble fragments, labeled in faded ink as low-risk offcuts from the Baldacchino restoration, had been stacked there sometime during the night. No one admitted to moving them. They formed a neat, impassable wall between the Monsignor and the lever. Anna reached the ceiling. The gears took her gently, almost lovingly. First, the scarf disappeared between brass teeth the size of altar candles. Then her hair, black curls catching, pulling, tearing free in wet handfuls. Her face was turned toward them, eyes bulging, mouth working soundlessly around the linen that filled it. There was a moment, terrible, endless, where she was suspended between the illuminated manuscripts stacked on the upper platen and the descending iron. Pages fluttered up around her like white moths. One sheet, loose, drifted down and landed at Maria Lucia's feet. On it, in fresh red ink that had not been there before, was a perfect print of Anna's screaming face, mouth distorted by the scarf. Then the platen met the lower plate with a sound like a crypt ceiling. The chains went slack. Something wet pattered onto the stone for several seconds afterward. When the upper plate rose again, slowly, obediently, as if nothing had happened, there was no body, only the book, now perfectly flat, its new crimson cover gleaming and embedded in the leather, like a fossil in rock. The faint outline of a woman's throat marked by the weave of a linen scarf. Monsignor Rinaldi stood very still, blood on his cassock that was not his own. He made the sign of the cross with finger that would not stop shaking. That night the level was sealed. Swiss guards in plain clothes arrived with welding torches and concrete. The iron door received new hinges, thicker bolts, a lock that took 3 keys turned simultaneously. The crates of marble were left where they stood, silent witnesses or accomplices. Maria Lucia was led out last, clutching Anna's red ribbon, all that had fallen back to earth. It was still warm. As the door boomed shut behind her, she heard it one final time, the soft, satisfied sound of pages turning somewhere in the dark, and beneath that, almost lost in the echo, the faintest rustle of linen on stone, like something dragging itself deeper, looking for a quieter place to finish what had begun. Chapter 4. The Relic That Hungers. The morning after Anna's disappearance tasted of copper and candle smoke that refused to leave the tongue. Maria Lucia woke on a narrow cot in the guest quarters above the archives, the kind of room reserved for visiting scholars who ask too many questions. The sheets were starched linen, cool against her skin, but she had not undressed. Her clothes still carried the faint warmth of the bindery, and something else, an iron sweet trace that made her think of communion wine spilled on stone. She sat up slowly, the red ribbon clutched in her fist like a relic of her own. It had dried stiff, the color of rust. No one came for her until the bells of St. Peter's rang none, muffled and distant, as though the basilica itself were under water. Then the door opened without a knock, and Monsignor Rinaldi stood there in a fresh cassock, the bloodstains gone as if they had never been. His eyes were red rimmed, but his voice was steady. "We return below," he said. "There is work." She wanted to scream, to demand where Anna's body was, why the guards had welded the door, what would be told to her family in Naples. Instead, she rose, smoothed her dupatta with shaking hands, and followed him down corridors that seemed longer than before, the air colder, as though the Vatican itself had turned its face away. The new door to the Scriptorium Inferiore was heavier iron, painted the same green as oxidized bronze. 3 Swiss guards in civilian clothes stood aside as Rinaldi turned the keys. The hinges sighed open on fresh oil, revealing the bindery exactly as they had left it, crates still blocking the emergency lever. The great press silent and gleaming, the crimson-bound book resting on a side table like a cat that had finished its cream. Luca, Sophia, and Matteo were already there, faces drawn, eyes avoiding the ceiling where the chains disappeared. No one spoke of Anna. It was as if she had been erased, her laughter scrubbed from the stone along with the blood. Rinaldi closed the door. The lock clicked with finality. "We continue," he said simply. "The church does not pause for sorrow." He placed a small wooden box on the table beside the book. Inside, wrapped in silk the color of old bone, lay a strip of cloth no longer than a man's hand. It was gossamer thin, almost translucent, stained in places with irregular sepia marks that shifted when you tried to focus on them. The veil of Veronica, or what the Vatican claimed was a fragment of it. One of the 3 authenticated copies kept in the secret archives. Though scholars had argued for centuries whether any true piece of the original cloth still existed. Some said the real veil had been lost during the sack of Rome in 1527. Others whispered it had never left Jerusalem, and what remained were echoes. Rinaldi lifted it with forceps, the cloth trembling as though alive. "In 1789, he began, voice low. "When the French came, they brought wagons of books seized from monasteries, works on alchemy, necromancy, the forbidden ars goetia. The Holy Office ordered them destroyed, not burned. Fire was too uncertain, crushed, obliterated between plates inlaid with holy relics, so that the words themselves would be pressed into sanctity and silenced forever." He laid the strip across the lower platen of the press, where a shallow recess had been carved centuries ago. The sepia stains seemed to drink the light. This fragment was set into the iron in 1792. It was meant to be temporary. The order to remove it came too late. The French were already at the gates again. It stayed, and the press changed. Luca shifted. Changed how? Rinaldi's eyes flicked upward, to the darkness where the chains hung like frozen waterfalls. It began to choose what it bound, not every book, only those that resisted. Sophia crossed herself, her gloved fingers leaving pale smudges on her cheek. You're saying the machine is possessed? I'm saying, Rinaldi replied carefully, that during the revolution, when soldiers broke into the old bindery, they did things, unspeakable things, to prisoners, to relics. Some believe the veil absorbed more than the Savior's face that day, that it took an imprint of something else when it was pressed against dying lips that cursed God with their final breath. Maria Lucia felt the dupatta tighten around her throat, though her hands were at her sides. The red ribbon in her pocket seemed suddenly hot. Matteo, ever practical, walked to the press and ran his fingers along the upper plate. There's no relic visible here, he said, just brass. Look closer. He did, and paled, etched into the metal, almost invisible unless the light caught it at the perfect angle, was a face, not Christ's. The features were distorted, elongated, the mouth open in what might have been ecstasy or agony. It was reversed, a negative image, as though something had been crushed so completely that its essence had bled through the iron and left a shadow. Maria Lucia recognized the shape of the mouth. It matched the tiny screaming face Anna had seen in the flyleaf. It matched the imprint now fossilized in the crimson cover of the finished book. We have to stop, she heard herself say. The words came out small, but they filled the room like incense. We destroy the press, we burn the veil, we tell someone. Rinaldi's smile was sad, almost kind. Child, the veil cannot be burned. It has survived fire before, and the press is part of the foundations. To destroy it would be to risk the necropolis itself, St. Peter's tomb. You would bring the basilica down upon the heads of thousands. No, we finish the work. We bind what must be bound, and we pray the hunger is sated. He gestured to the next volume waiting on the table, larger, older, its cover cracked and weeping flakes of gold like dandruff from a corpse. They worked in near silence for hours that felt like days. The air grew thick, viscous, pressing against the eardrums. Every tool seemed heavier, the bone folder cold as ice, the glue smelling faintly of myrrh and corruption. When Sophia dropped a needle, it rang on the stone like a chapel bell at a funeral. At one point, Maria Lucia glanced up and saw the veil fragment moving. Not much, just a faint ripple, as though something beneath the cloth were breathing. The sepia stains had deepened, forming eyes that were not eyes. She looked away. When she looked back, the cloth was still, but the face in the brass plate had turned, imperceptibly, toward her. They broke only once. For water that tasted of rust and stone, Matteo pulled Maria Lucia aside near the blocked emergency lever. I found something, he whispered, pressing a folded scrap of paper into her hand. In the counterweight shaft, a diary page from 1793. She waited until Rinaldi was distracted with Luca before unfolding it. The handwriting was frantic, ink blotted with what might have been tears or blood. It began to feed on loose things, hair, cloth, fingers that strayed too close. The veil is no longer his, it is theirs now. Whatever screamed when they pressed the French girl's face into it, she was alive when they started, not when they finished. Pray for us. The page ended with a single line scrawled larger, over and over until the pen tore the paper. It hungers for a woman's scream. Maria Lucia's knees buckled. She stuffed the note into her pocket beside Anna's ribbon. That was when the lights flickered, once, twice, and the temperature plummeted so sharply that frost bloomed on the brass screw like lace on a wedding veil. From the ceiling came a sound, soft, wet, almost tender, fabric dragging across stone, slow, patient. Everyone looked up. High in the darkness, something pale descended along the main chain, inch by inch, wrapped around the links like a scarf. At first, Maria Lucia thought it was Anna's linen scarf, somehow dislodged. Then it reached the light. It was longer now, much longer, stained crimsons in places that spread even as they watched, and at its frayed end, something moved, dark curls, matted with gold leaf and blood, turning slowly as if seeking a familiar face. The thing that had been Anna opened its mouth. No sound came out, only the soft rustle of pages turning inside a throat that should not exist, and the veil fragment on the platen rippled in answer. The reversed face smiling with teeth that had never been there before. Maria Lucia took one step back. Her dupatta lifted of its own accord, the embroidered edge rising like a cobra tasting the air. Somewhere in the walls, the counterweights began to shift, a low, hungry groan that promised the next binding would not be a book. Chapter 5. Hair and Habit. The days that followed Anna tasted like ash and unspoken accusations. They were no longer allowed to leave the scriptorium inferiore at all. Thin mattresses appeared in an alcove behind the shelves, army cots that smelled of mothballs and old wars. A single chemical toilet was wheeled in and curtained off with canvas the color of dried blood. Meals arrived through a hatch in the door, trays of cold pasta, bottled water, communion wafers wrapped in wax paper like a cruel joke. No one spoke of escape. The guards outside had been doubled. Maria Lucia heard their boots whenever she pressed her ear to the iron. Paranoia settled over the four survivors like damp rot. Luca's hands trembled so badly he could barely thread a needle. Sophia had begun whispering the Jesus prayer under her breath in a loop that never ended, the words slurring into nonsense. And Mateo spent hours staring at the emergency lever. Still blocked by the marble crates, no one had moved, as though willing them to vanish. Maria Lucia cut her hair. Not all of it, just enough. She took the sharpest paring knife from the tool roll, stood over a cracked mirror propped against a shelf of chained grimoires, and sawed away the long black strands that had reached her waist since childhood. They fell in heavy ropes, each one landing with a soft, final sound that made her flinch. When she was done, her head felt strangely light, the nape of her neck exposed and vulnerable for the first time since she was 12. She gathered the severed hair into a neat bundle, tied it with Anna's red ribbon, and hid it inside her mattress, a talisman or evidence. She kept the dupatta, though couldn't bring herself to remove it entirely. She wound it tighter, tucking every edge beneath the collar of her blouse until it felt like a collar of silk rope. They worked on the next volume in near silence, a 16th century necromantic treatise bound in what might once have been human skin. pale and freckled across the spine. The cover needed reinforcing with new leather dyed the exact shade of a fresh bruise. Maria Lucia's job was to pare the edges thin enough to turn in without bulk. The knife was heavy in her hand, the blade catching the bare bulbs in flashes that hurt the eyes. She noticed the secondary chain drive for the first time that afternoon. It ran along the floor near the base of the press, half hidden beneath a low workbench, a thinner chain than the main drive, meant to tension the smaller gears that adjusted the platen's angle. It was meant to be stationary during pressing, locked by a simple pin Matteo had oiled a dozen times. But as she knelt to measure a strip of leather, she saw it twitch just once, like a cat's tail. She told herself it was a draft. Later, when the glue was setting and the others had retreated to their cots, she returned alone to check the drying boards. The room was dimmer than usual. Two of the bulbs had burned out, and no one had replaced them. Shadows pooled thick in the corners, and the press loomed like a sleeping judge. Her remaining hair had begun to escape the dupatta again, stubborn curls that refused obedience. One lock slipped free, brushing her cheek like a child's finger. She reached up to tuck it back. That was when it happened. The curl lifted away from her skin, drawn forward as though by static. She felt the tug at her scalp, gentle at first, almost curious, then sharper. The chain on the floor began to move, links rising in a slow wave that made no sound at all. She tried to step back. Too late. The escaped lock caught on a tooth of the secondary gear, just a single strand at first, then more, pulled from beneath the silk, like threads from a tapestry unraveling in fast forward. Pain exploded across her scalp, bright and white. She screamed, hands flying to her head. But the chain only pulled harder. More hair came free in wet handfuls, roots tearing with tiny popping sounds she felt more than heard. She was dragged forward onto her knees, then onto her stomach, face inches from the stone. The chain accelerated, reeling her in like a fish. Blood poured warm down her forehead, into her eyes, tasting of salt and iron. She clawed at the floor, nails splintering on the ancient brick, leaving red trails that looked like desperate writing. Luca woke first, shouting her name. Sophia began screaming the Jesus prayer at the top of her lungs. Matteo lunged for the main wheel, spinning it backward with strength, born of pure terror. The secondary chain did not slow. Maria Lucia felt her scalps lift away in one continuous sheet, skin parting from skull with a sound like Velcro ripped in a cathedral. The pain was beyond screaming now. It was a white-hot silence that filled the world. She watched, detached, as a flap of her own skin, still attached to long black hair, disappeared into the gears, wound tight around the spindle like a dark ribbon. Then, impossibly, the chain stopped, just stopped, mid-pull, mid-scream. The gears locked with a metallic sigh, as though something had changed its mind. She collapsed sideways, blood pooling beneath her cheek, warm and sticky. The room spun. She heard running feet, hands on her shoulders, Sophia sobbing in Italian too fast to follow. Someone pressed a wad of felt against the raw ruin of her scalp. The pain ebbed and flowed like tides. When they rolled her over, gentle as handling a relic, She saw it, burned into the stone where her head had been, not etched, not carved, burned, was a perfect imprint of a woman's face in agony, mouth open in a silent scream, eyes wide, hair streaming backward as though still being pulled. The features were hers, but distorted, elongated, the mouth too wide, the eyes inverted like the negative on the veil, and around the neck, clear as embroidery, the woven pattern of her monsoon blue dupatta. The burn was still smoking faintly, the stone blackened in precise lines no human hand could have drawn in those few seconds. Luca crossed himself and backed away until his shoulders hit a shelf. Books rattled in their chains like prisoners sensing freedom. Matteo stared at the imprint, then at the secondary chain. The flap of scalp and hair was gone, swallowed completely, no trace left among the gears. The chain hung slack now, innocent, gleaming with fresh blood that dripped in slow, deliberate drops. Plink, saplink, me plink. Each drop landed exactly on the burned mouth of the stone face and was absorbed like water into parched earth. Sophia whispered, Madre de Dio, it's marking its territory. Maria Lucia tried to speak, but her throat was raw from screaming. She managed one word, barely a breath. Anna, because in the burned eyes of the imprint, just for a second, she had seen something move, a reflection that was not hers, dark curls, a flash of red ribbon. The press answered with a low, satisfied hum, the same note it had sung the first day, only deeper now, intimate, like a lover clearing its throat. High above, in the dark between the counterweights, something shifted with the soft sound of long hair brushing stone, and the imprinted face on the floor smiled just a little, as though tasting what came next. Chapter 6. The Blocked Path. The bandages came off on what might have been a Sunday, though no bells reached them anymore to mark the hours. Maria Lucia sat on the edge of her cot, while Sophia unwound the gauze with fingers that still shook. The air kissed the raw skin like ice water on a burn, and she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. What the mirror showed her was a patchwork of scab and shiny pink flesh, hair growing back in uneven tufts, like grass after a fire. The doctors who had stitched her, faceless men in surgical masks who came and went through the iron door without a word, had done good work. She would live. She would keep most of her scalp, but the shape of her head felt wrong now, lighter, as though something essential had been taken along with the skin. Sophia's eyes, filled with tears, she refused to let fall. You look beautiful, she lied. Maria Lucia touched the ridge of a suture and felt the stone imprint throb in answer, somewhere beneath the floor, like a second heart remembering its twin. Monsignor Rinaldi entered without knocking, carrying a folder stamped with the crossed keys and triple tiara. He laid it on the table as though it were a relic itself. An inquiry was held, he said, not meeting anyone's eyes. The area has been classified low risk. Production resumes immediately. Luca laughed, one sharp bark that echoed off the vaults like a gunshot. Low risk? After Anna? After her? He pointed at Maria Lucia's bandaged head. Rinaldi's voice did not rise. The crates were placed for structural support during seismic retrofitting. The emergency lever remains accessible in the event of genuine crisis. Modern kill switches would require drilling into load-bearing tufa. Unacceptable. The Holy Father himself has been briefed. We trust in providence. He turned to leave, then paused. Tonight we work alone. No guards, no witnesses. The next volume must be finished before dawn. Pray for strength. The door closed. The lock turned. 4 people stared at the marble crates that had never been moved, not 1 inch. Since Anna died, night came without warning. The bulbs dimmed to a sullen amber, the way they do in hospitals when someone is about to code. Matteo tried the door anyway. It held like the gates of hell. Sophia curled into a ball on her cot and rocked. The Jesus prayer now only a hiss between clenched teeth. Luca paced, muttering in Bolognese dialect, too fast and profane for anyone to follow. Maria Lucia sat apart. The red ribbon wound tight around her wrist, like a tourniquet for the soul. She could feel the press watching, not the brass and iron, those were only its bones. The thing inside, it had tasted her and found her wanting, or perhaps it was saving her for something richer. At what felt like 2 in the morning, Rinaldi's voice crackled through a small brass speaking tube none of them had noticed before, set high in the wall like a confessional grate. Begin. They moved like sleepwalkers. The final volume was the largest yet, a 13th century palimpsest. Vellum scraped and reused so many times the ghosts of older texts bled through whenever the light was low. Its boards were black with age, the spine cracked open like a mouth that had screamed too long. They laid it on the lower platen with the reverence of undertakers dressing a corpse. Luca and Matteo took the wheel. Sophia fed the chains by hand, her movements jerky, eyes fixed on the ceiling as though expecting Anna to drop from the dark. Maria Lucia stood at the glue bench, stirring a pot that smelled of hide and old sins. No one spoke the obvious. There were now only 4 of them, and the wheel was meant for 6. They turned, slowly at first, the great screw descending with the patience of glaciers. The temperature plunged. Their breath hung in the air like incense, somewhere far above. The counterweights shifted, not falling yet, only tasting the possibility. Then the press woke up, not with a groan or a shudder, with a sigh, soft, intimate, almost grateful. The chains began to move on their own. Links rose from the floor like serpents charmed by music only they could hear. The secondary drive, the one that had taken Maria Lucia's scalp, spun backward, then forward, then backward again, hunting. The marble crates trembled, dust sifting from their edges as though something behind them was pushing to get out. Matteo saw it first. The wheel, he whispered. It's turning itself. Luca tried to brace it. The iron burned cold under his palms, frost blooming across the spokes. The wheel spun faster, dragging him with it. His feet left the ground. He hung for a moment by his wrists, mouth open in surprise rather than fear. Then the main chain lashed out. It whipped around his torso once, twice, pinning his arms. The links were warm, body temperature warm. It lifted him the way a python lifts a deer, slow and inevitable, toward the gears that waited above like the jaws of some ancient leviathan. He did not scream, not at first. He looked down at the rest of them, eyes wide with a terrible clarity, and said only, "I'm sorry." The chain coiled higher, looping his neck. His rosary, the one his grandmother had given him on his first communion, spilled from his pocket, wooden beads clicking like teeth. The chain took that too, winding the crucifix tight against his throat until the tiny carved Christ pressed into his Adam's apple. Sophia ran for the emergency lever. She never made it. From behind the marble crates, the ones labeled low risk, something unfolded. Not a hand, not exactly. A length of pale linen, stained and elongated, ending in dark curls that still held flecks of gold leaf. It moved with the grace of smoke, wrapping Sophia's ankles before she had taken 3 steps. She fell hard, chin cracking on the stone. The linen thing dragged her backward, heels carving furrows in the dust. She clawed at the floor, nails breaking, screaming in a voice that cracked like a child's. "Help me, Maria, please." The chain took her head first. It happened faster than thought. One moment she was reaching for Maria Lucia. The next, her head was between the gears, curls catching first, then scalp, then the soft give of skull. There was a wet crunch, like stepping on a bird's egg filled with blood. Her body jerked once, legs kicking in perfect rhythm with the turning wheel, then went limp. The linen thing, Anna's scarf, or what had become of it, released her ankles and slithered away. Satisfied, Luca was next. The chain around his neck tightened, his face purpled, tongue protruding. The rosary beads burst one by one, scattering across the floor like hail on a coffin lid. He was pulled upward into the dark between the plates, feet dangling, toes pointed like a dancer's. The last thing Maria Lucia saw of him was his hand, still clutching the broken crucifix. Before the upper platen descended and pressed him flat against the book, the sound was not loud, just a soft, final settling, the way a door closes on a house where everyone is dead. The press stopped. The chains hung still, dripping. On the lower platen, the book lay perfect, covers aligned, spine rounded, not a wrinkle in the leather. Embedded in its surface, side by side, were 2 new imprints, Luca's face, eyes bulging, mouth open around the ghost of a prayer, and Sophia's, half crushed, one eye staring out in perfect, terrible detail. The marble crates shifted, just enough for a hand to slip through if someone were desperate. Maria Lucia stood alone in the center of the room, blood in her hair that was not all hers, the red ribbon cutting into her wrist. From the speaking tube came Rinaldi's voice, calm as ever. "Come upstairs, child. It is finished for tonight." The chains stirred again, very gently, almost affectionately, and something brushed the back of her neck, a strand of long black hair that was not attached to her head anymore. Chapter 7: The Living Relic. The iron door opened with the slow reluctance of a confessional that already knows the sin. Monsignor Rinaldi stepped through alone, his cassock unstained for the first time in days, as though the blood had chosen not to follow him. He carried no lantern. The dim amber bulbs were enough to turn his face into a skull wrapped in parchment. Behind him, the guards locked the door again. three keys turning in perfect unison, and their footsteps retreated until even the echo gave up. Maria Lucia stood in the center of the bindery, exactly where Luca and Sophia had died. The stone beneath her bare feet was still warm from their bodies, or perhaps from something older that had learned to mimic heat. Her scalp throbbed under the fresh bandages, each pulse syncing with the faint drip of water somewhere in the walls. She had not slept, could not. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the tug again, the sensation of her own skin peeling away like old wallpaper. Rinaldi did not speak at first. He walked the perimeter slowly, fingertips trailing across the shelves where the chained books shifted in their sleep. When he reached the press, he stopped, laid both palms on the lower platen, and bowed his head as though greeting an altar. Only then did he look at her. "You are the last," he said, not an accusation, a fact, delivered with the same tenderness a priest might use when saying, "Ait misesket" over a coffin. Maria Lucia's voice came out raw, cracked from screaming she no longer remembered. "Why me?" He smiled, small and terrible. "Because you still wear it." His gaze dropped to the dupatta, wound so tightly around her neck that the embroidered edge cut faint lines into her skin. The others removed what could catch. "You kept your offering." She reached instinctively to loosen it, then stopped. Her fingers felt thick, distant. The silk had grown warmer since the others died, as though it carried their body heat now, hoarded like a miser. Rinaldi moved to the small wooden box that had once held the veil fragment. It was empty. He turned it upside down. A single strand of dark hair, Luca's perhaps, or Sophia's, drifted out and settled on the stone like incense ash. "The veil was never truly Christ's alone," he began, voice dropping to the register, reserved for deathbed confessions. When Veronica wiped his face on the road to Calvary, the cloth took the image willingly, light on light, but cloth remembers pressure in 1793 during the Terror. French soldiers brought a girl here, 16, maybe 17, a nun from a dissolved convent. They pressed her face into the relic while it lay on the plate, laughing, saying they would give the devil a prettier imprint than God ever had. She was alive when the weights began to fall, screaming, cursing. Her breath fogged the cloth just as his once did, only hers carried hate. He looked up into the darkness, where the chains hung like frozen vines. Some forbidden texts, those we just bound, claim that when the true face is pressed too hard, too long, with the wrong kind of agony, the image inverts, the light becomes shadow, the Lucifer imprint. It doesn't kill quickly. Maria Lucia, that would be mercy. It binds, souls into end papers, screams into gold leaf. Every book finished down here carries a voice now. Listen. He fell silent. At first there was nothing. Then, faint as breath on a mirror, a chorus, Anna laughing too loud, Luca praying in Bolognese, Sophia's Jesus prayer stuttering into a sob. The sounds came from the shelves, from the crimson volumes, from the very air, a library of the damned, whispering in languages that hurt to hear. Maria Lucia took one step back. Her heel came down on something soft. Anna's red ribbon somehow returned to the floor, soaked dark. It squelched. Rinaldi continued, softer. The machine was built to destroy heresy. Instead, it became the perfect confessional for the inverted image. Every death feeds it, every loose thread, every curl of hair, every careless scarf, an offering. It wants completion, a final binding. He reached into his cassock and drew out the veil fragment itself. No forceps now, bare fingers. The cloth writhed in his grip like a living thing. The sepia stains had arranged themselves into a face that was almost beautiful, high cheekbones, full lips parted in ecstasy or agony, eyes that looked straight at Maria Lucia and through her. Do you know why it spared you until now? He asked. Because you brought it something it truly desired, something from far away, silk dyed with monsoon water, thread spun by hands that never knew this crypt, a flavor it had never tasted. The dupatta moved, not in a breeze. There was no breeze. The embroidered end lifted from her collarbone, tasting the air like a cobra's tongue, slowly, lovingly. It unwound itself from her neck, the silk whispering as it went. She grabbed at it, but her fingers passed through fabric that felt suddenly insubstantial, like smoke made heavy. Rinaldi watched, tears on his cheeks that might have been repentance or relief. It needs a woman's scream to finish the inversion, he said. The French girl gave it hate. Anna gave it laughter. Sophia gave it prayer. Luca gave it faith. You, Maria Lucia, you will give it devotion, the purest offering of all. The dupatta rose higher, floating horizontally now, the pale blue silk darkening as though drinking shadow. It coiled once around her throat, gentle, almost tender, then tightened, not enough to choke, not yet, just enough to remind her how it felt to be held. From the shelves came a rustle, like 1,000 pages turning at once. The bound books opened by themselves, spines cracking, revealing end papers that were no longer blank, faces pressed against the paper from the inside, Anna's mouth open in mid-laugh, Luca's eyes bulging in prayer, Sophia's single crushed orb staring. They mouthed words she could almost hear. Join us. Maria Lucia clawed at the silk. It only tightened further, lifting her onto her toes. The bandages on her scalp split. Blood trickled warm down her neck and was absorbed instantly by the cloth, turning the monsoon blue to arterial purple. Rinaldi knelt, actually knelt, on the stone in front of the press, hands clasped. Forgive me, he whispered, though it was not clear to whom. I thought if we fed it enough, it would sleep. I thought one more book, one more soul, and the imprint would be complete. The inversion finished, the veil restored, but it was never about restoration. It was about replacement. The counterweights groaned high above, a sound like the earth itself clearing its throat. The dupatta pulled her backward, one inexorable inch at a time, toward the lower platen where the veil fragment waited, flapping like a hooked fish. Maria Lucia's feet left the ground. She dangled now, toes brushing the stone, the silk cutting deeper. Her vision tunneled. In the darkening edges, she saw the imprinted faces on the floor, her own screaming visage from the scalping. Anna's distorted grin begin to weep blood that ran upward, against gravity, into the dupatta. Rinaldi rose, eyes shining with something that might have been madness or grace. There is still a choice, he said, voice trembling. Destroy the veil, and everything it has taken escapes. Every soul, every scream, into the basilica above during Sunday Mass, or let it finish with you, complete the binding, seal the inversion forever. He placed the fragment on the platen directly beneath her. The face on the cloth smiled with teeth that had never belonged to Christ. The dupatta lowered her slowly, reverently, until her cheek brushed the relic. It was warm, breathing, and hungry. Chapter 8. What was bound shall not be unbound. The dupatta did not choke her. It cradled, like a mother rocking a child she has already decided to drown. Maria Lucia's feet left the stone entirely now. Her body suspended a handspan above the lower platen. The silk had thickened, no longer cloth, but something fibrous and alive. Veins of crimson threading through the monsoon blue until it looked like a length of intestine still warm from the body. It pulsed against her throat in time with a heartbeat that was not hers. Below her, the veil fragment waited, sepia stains writhing into a face that was almost complete. The mouth stretched wider than anatomy allowed, lined with tiny embroidered edges that matched her dupatta exactly. The eyes were black pits, reflecting every death the press had taken. Anna's laugh frozen mid-note. Luca's prayer cut short. Sophia's single crushed orb weeping dust. Monsignor Rinaldi stood 3 paces away, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles shone white as bone. His lips moved without sound, an act of contrition, or perhaps the words of consecration spoken backward. Tears cut clean paths through the dust on his cheeks. Choose, he whispered, voice cracking like old vellum. Burn it and free them all, or finish the binding and cage the inversion forever. One scream, Maria Lucia, one perfect, devoted scream, and the veil becomes whole again. The hunger ends. She tried to speak, but the silk filled her mouth now, tasting of salt and iron and distant Kerala rain. Her lungs burned. Black spots blossomed at the edges of her vision, like ink dropped in water. The choice was a lie, of course. She could feel it in the way the press crooned to her, a low, resonant hymn that vibrated through the chains and into her ribs. It did not want balance restored. It wanted ascension. The inverted image was not a parasite. It was the final evolution. Christ's face pressed so many times, in so much agony, until the light flipped and became something that wore holiness like a skin. Her fingers, numb and distant, brushed the edge of the platen. There, half buried under the veil, lay the small silver scalpel she had used to pare leather on the very first day. Its handle was warm, as though it had been waiting for her touch. She closed her hand around it. Rinaldi saw. His eyes widened. No. With the last strength in her arms, she drove the blade downward, not into the veil, but into the silk that held her. The dupatta screamed, not metaphor, a real, tearing shriek that came from the fabric itself, layers of voices braided together, Anna's bright laughter curdling into rage, Sophia's prayer twisting into blasphemy, Luca's final apology stretched thin as gold leaf. The blade parted the weave, and something poured out, dark threads that writhed like smoke, carrying the smell of scorched hair and melted wax. The silk loosened. She dropped. She hit the platen hard, knees cracking against oak older than nations. The veil was beneath her now, pressed between her palms and the wood. It was hot, fever hot, and it beat like a second heart trying to crawl into her chest. Rinaldi lunged, but the chains were faster. One whipped out, coiling his ankle with the tenderness of a rosary. Another looped his wrists. He was yanked backward, cassock ripping, until he hung spread-eagled against the brass screw like a penitent nailed to his own cross. "Maria Lucia," he gasped, "if you destroy it—" She didn't let him finish. With both hands, she tore the veil in half. The sound was worse than any death she had witnessed, wet parchment ripping, 1,000 pages screaming at once, the basilica above groaning as though its foundations had been kicked. Light exploded outward, not holy, not infernal, but something in between, the color of bruises under candlelight. The sepia face on the cloth inverted fully, eyes flooding black, mouth opening in a grin that showed too many teeth. Every book on the shelves burst open at once. Pages tore free and swirled upward in a cyclone of screaming vellum, faces pressed against the paper from the inside, pounding to get out. Anna's laugh echoed from a dozen volumes. Luca's broken rosary beads clattered across the floor like hail. Sophia's single eye blinked from the end paper of a crimson folio. The bound souls were rising. Rinaldi thrashed as the chains dragged him higher. "You've killed us all." Maria Lucia stood in the heart of the storm, hair whipping around her ruined scalp, blood and ink streaking her face like war paint. She looked up into the shaft where the counterweights hung and saw them plummet, not in sequence, all at once. 6 blocks of Carrara marble carved with defaced angels dropped through the necropolis like judgment. The impact when they hit the bottom was not sound but absence. Every candle, every bulb, every scream snuffed out in the same heartbeat. Darkness swallowed the Bindari absolute. When the emergency lamps flickered on minutes or hours later, the press was gone. Not destroyed, gone. Only a perfect circle of scorched stone remained where it had stood, edges still glowing faint orange. The chains lay melted into the floor like spilled wax. The books were ash. Rinaldi's cassock hung empty from a single link. Gently swaying, Maria Lucia was alone. She climbed, hand over hand, up the iron walkways that now hung twisted and silent, past the place where the counterweights had shattered into dust as white as communion hosts, into the excavated levels of the necropolis where ancient tombs gaped open like mouths that had forgotten how to close. She emerged through a service hatch into the basilica itself, just as the first gray light of dawn crept through the high windows. Tourists would arrive in hours. Pilgrims were already lining up outside. The scent of coffee and incense drifted on the air as if nothing had changed. She walked barefoot across the marble, leaving bloody footprints that faded behind her like sins forgiven too easily. At the high altar she stopped. There, pinned beneath the papal cathedra by a shard of Carrara marble no larger than a communion wafer, was a single page. It was blank, until it wasn't. Slowly, as though remembering how to bleed. A face appeared in fresh crimson, a woman screaming, mouth distorted by silk, eyes wide with the knowledge of what comes after the final binding. Around her neck, embroidered in perfect detail, was a monsoon blue dupatta. The page fluttered once, caught in a draft that came from nowhere. From far below, or perhaps from directly above, in the dome where Michelangelo's God reached out to Adam, came the faintest sound, a low, resonant hum, the press beginning again, somewhere holy. Thank you for descending with me. Tell me, which death stayed with you the longest? Anna in the gears, Maria Lucia's scalping, or the page waiting under the papal throne? Drop it in the comments, because whatever was bound down there might still be reading them.